My name is Jeremy Griffith. I've been a VFX artist in games for roughly 10 years. I have a background in AAA shooters like BioShock Infinite and Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 3. In addition, I've worked on a lot of smaller games in a contract capacity and released a few of my own games that I solo developed, like Flippy Cups. And now I'm a senior VFX artist at Riot. So what this talk is about is trying to drill into one of the central tensions that we face in VFX animation, and that's related to what our target actually is. Are we going for realism? Are we trying to perfectly capture the surface properties of all the natural phenomenon like water? Or is our real target more of a more vague believability? I see this debate as mapping cleanly onto, is our target detail or is it actually underlying energy? This is something that we face all the time in specifically game VFX because we take things like this puff of smoke or cloud. Every point of detail in this image is implying a vector, a directional vector of how energy is moving. And then we do this, and we completely violate those energies. And our work tends to fall flat, at least in my opinion. So this talk is going to go into how I like to make fire from leaves. But before we do that, I want to talk about why I would choose to do that in the first place and why it works. And I see why it works as being directly related to ideas from philosophical Taoism. Taoism is a complex, developed philosophy that originated in the Warring States period in classical China. And kind of the foundational idea of Taoism is that there are deep running relationships between very different things in the world. There is, in fact, this organizing principle or process that we are all a part of, that we all emerge from, called the Tao. So what this talk is going to attempt to do is trace the relationship between these ideas from Taoism and world art history, and how I am going to argue that it can be applied to VFX animation and help us with our work. So the way this talk is organized, we've already done the problem statement. We're going to trace this problem through some examples in art history. We're going to consider a mindset that would privilege energy over detail to the expense of detail, trace that mindset to Taoism specifically, and put this mindset to work in VFX shaders. So I have kind of a weird mixed background. I have an academic background in comparative philosophy at a graduate level with a special focus on China and with an even more detailed focus in Taoism in particular. However, I do not speak Mandarin. My pronunciation is awful. To any native or learned speakers in the room, I'm sorry. So this tension between detail and energy can be observed even in still art. As an example of detail without energy, observe this beautiful painting, Watson and the Shark by John Copley. It's a gorgeous painting. I've always liked this painting. The composition is incredible, the atmosphere, the drama, the figures. But the water, I have some problems with as a VFX artist. It's incredibly detailed, it's richly treated, but it kind of looks like gelatin. It's like a Jell-O mold, and the boy and the shark are like fruit in the Jell-O. The water isn't really interacting with them, and the water itself, I have a hard time seeing an internal logic of energy at work. So, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have energy without detail. And I'm bad at PowerPoint. Yay, all right. So as an example of energy without detail, this is 1,000 miles along the river Yangtze. The author is unknown, but it's dated to the Ming Dynasty. And the approach here is radically different than the John Copley painting. There's no surface detail whatsoever to this water. It's all energy. The only things telling you that this is water are the way that the water is interacting with other things, its own internal logic of how it flows, the fact that there are eddies forming in these little pockets the way you would expect water to form eddies. The artist here has eschewed all detail in favor of energy. And I find that very, very compelling. I'll just leave it. All right, we're back. So to do a deep dive on this particular approach to depicting water, we could look at Ma Yuan's water album, or variably a study on the properties of water from the Song Dynasty. And you see a very similar logic to the approach here. There is little to no surface detail. It's every stroke on the page is rather focused on capturing a deep sense of the logic of how this stuff moves and the shapes that it creates when it becomes turbulent, and contrasting those shapes when it is laminar. So, okay, why do I find these depictions so successful despite their simplicity? They don't have the beautiful surface detail in this Copley. They don't have the amazing sense of dimensionality and drama and lighting in this Turner, and they certainly don't have this incredible sense of surface reflectivity from this Anders Zorn. This is a watercolor, by the way. It's one of my favorite pictures of water in the world. Now, this speaks to me specifically as a VFX artist. So, what I'd like to argue is that these artists were essentially drawing with energy in mind at the forefront. They had learned at a deep level how water works by observing it, and then were recreating that on the fly with their brush. So, as we've seen, this tension between surface detail and underlying energy can be found even in still images, but motion makes this infinitely worse of a problem. In fact, erroneous detail or superfluous detail is far, far worse for us than a lack of detail. For myself in my own work, criticizing my own work in the work of others, I call this wrong shapes. Going back to our smoke puff example, as we were talking about, every point on this cloud, this richly detailed cloud, is implying its own vector of motion, its own vector of energy. And when we do this, we completely violate that sense of energy. This is fundamentally wrong. And we, to each other, we ask this question all the time, like, does it feel right? Yeah, that doesn't feel right. And what we're really doing is asking ourselves, like, is the energy right here? Or are we fundamentally violating a deep logic by doing that? So we're left with a question, okay, what led the Chinese inkwash masters down this route of privileging energy over detail in their work? And I would argue that, bringing it back to Taoism, that it was Taoism. So Taoism, as a philosophy, this is going to be a caricature of Taoism. I don't have time here to go into a rigorous laying out of everything about Taoism, but if you want to invite me to do a talk on that sometime, I'd be happy to do it. Taoism looks to nature, but not just nature, the natural, the spontaneous, the unspoiled. It's kind of Rousseauian in that sense. And there's this term, zuran, which means the self-so. To act with zuran means that you are so unencumbered by falseness, that you just overflow with genuine action. Your spirit bubbles forth directly into action. So the foundational concept, as we were looking at a little bit in the beginning, of Taoism is the Tao. And this could be thought of as the way of all things as they hang together, the process, the generating function. But there's also a natural individual way of each thing individually, its own path to establishing that spirit of Zerdan. And because we are all grounded in this process, there is a radical sense of interconnectedness taken as a foundational assumption in Taoism. This is referred to in the texts as boundlessness, no boundaries between things, or my favorite, intoxicating bottomlessness, essentially that every object in the universe opens itself up to every other object in the universe. And there is a radical sense in which I'm looking at the entire universe when I'm looking at this box of water. So, from Tao Te Ching, chapter 62, way-making, or Tao, is the flowing together of all things. There is truly in the world a deep-running sense of connection between very disparate things. I actually think this is a more true way to think about the world than to assume radical separateness between things. So from this assumption of interconnectedness, Taoism develops a morality of non-interventionism. It's encapsulated beautifully in this phrase, wu wei, which means acting without acting, or non-coercive action. It is essentially acting with the grain of the Tao, along the grain of the Tao, not forcing things, not getting in the ways of other things. This is put beautifully in Tao Te Ching, chapter 64. Those who would do things ruin them. Those who would control things lose them. Hence, because the sages do things non-coercively with wu wei, they do not ruin them. And because they do not try to control things, they do not lose them. So, taking a richly detailed puff of smoke and then rotating it to the right is not acting with wu wei. And in the sense, wu wei is both moral and practical. It is both what you should do because you don't want to harm other things, you don't want to coerce other beings, but it's also what you should do if you want to be successful. There's a sense in which acting with wu wei relies on being able to see these deep relationships between things, between beings in the world, and act in accordance with those relationships, to not do violence to them. And this is illustrated beautifully in the Zhuangzi, my favorite book in the world, in this parable of Cook Ding or Butcher Ding. So how this story goes is the ruler of some province is having a cow butchered for him, and he is amazed at the skill, the virtuosity of this butcher. The butcher's knife just goes clean through as if through nothing, and the cow is fully butchered within a matter of minutes. And the ruler says, "How did you come across this skill? How did you come by this?" And the butcher says, "It's not skill, it's Tao. When I first started butchering cows, all I saw was the cow from the outside. I saw its surface. But as I butchered more and more cows, I stopped looking with my visual eyes and began to see the deep structure of the cow and how it relates to the universe with my mind's eye. And so he just follows the Tao through the cow." And this is from a famous illustrated book of the Zhuangzi, which I highly recommend. It's very popular in both Taiwan and China. It's highly, highly recommended. So the butcher has learned to see the deep relationships between things. He has internalized the Tao in a way that helps him do his work. In this case, it's the Tao of cow, but we can extrapolate this to other things. We can extrapolate this to aesthetics. So if you want to be a Taoist artist, what you would do is internalize the way of your subject. such that you can capture it with wu without doing violence to what it is trying to do naturally on its own. This is put beautifully in this book, The Great Image Has No Form, by Francois Jullien, as being used by the universe to depict itself, rather than trying to represent the universe from without. And he didn't just make this up as some French guy. He drew this encapsulation of a set of ideas from the writers themselves, or the artists themselves, from their writings, such as gouache. So, to put a pin on it, if you create art with wu, letting a subject ring true with its own ziran, then the Dao itself can shine through. In essence, you're not getting in the way of your subject like with erroneous detail or superfluous detail. And the artists that created these depictions of water that we're considering in this talk absolutely had these ideas in mind. To drive home how ubiquitous these concepts like Dao, wu, and ziran were in the culture, consider an amazing phenomenon, scholars' rocks. So scholars' rocks are rocks that are thought to portray the Tao, in a sense. They're like a shadow of the Tao. They are records of energies as they traced the course. And then you can find them on desks, in gardens. There's even this painting called Mifu Bowing to a Rock by Guoshu, which shows how deeply ingrained this idea of venerating the Tao as you find it in the world to be. Okay, so what the hell does this have to do with VFX animation? So, just like a scholar's rock, every static structure in the world is actually a record of energy flow. Leaves are a record of the energy as it flowed through the growing leaf. Just like a scholar's rock, a leaf is a record of energies flowing through the Tao. So, how do we make use of this? I personally see a deep connection between the shapes in leaves and the shapes in fire. So, stepping through this quickly, removing some of the detail of a leaf gets us access to kind of a more general truth about how they grow. It is essentially unlocking energies hidden behind the specific details. And then we can build that detail back up with motion and with logics, internal logics. This is an offset internal logic of leaf. And then we can overlay an internal logic of fire, which is really just a gradient of heat and fuel. And then clamp it, bring some interior detail back with multiply and apply color. And that's how I make fire from leaves. This works because I truly believe there is a deep relationship between the forms in leaves and the forms in fire. And because static structures are records of energy flow, we can gain access to those, but we have to remove some of the detail that would otherwise be erroneous and superfluous in what we're trying to create, in this case, fire. So, a usefulness of this approach is getting intraparticle motion, which is a type of detail that works much better in motion than taking static detail, like in that cloud, and moving it around like this. However, we also can't do that with this. That's probably even worse. So, working in this way kind of pushes you into a different workflow. It's less about sprites, rotating sprites around, and more about meshes as paths for the energy to move. And the benefit of this is it's extremely flexible. If you've taken the time to build up energy that's truthful to the subject, then you can give it all sorts of paths to follow and it will feel right. You can also change the scale. You might have to adjust, but it kind of just works. So the general technique is getting at the more general relationships between things by removing detail and then building that detail back up. Unlocking the energy kind of locked in these static structures in the world, and then letting it roam on the paths that we can make for it. And this doesn't just work by accident. Like this, there really are deep relationships between things in the world. Like giraffe skin, the caustic patterns on the bottom of a pool, and cracked earth. Other people have noticed this. I highly recommend the work of Philip Ball on this subject. And we actually already do this all the time with noise textures. Noise textures are a general statement about how things in the world work. And they don't work by accident. They're actually related in deep ways to how the universe is actually structured. Voronoi, for example, can be thought of as like this general case that shows up in many different objects as like a sort of tension that gives rise to boundaries or boundedness. And you can see Voronoi at work in these three things that we've been considering. Ryan Brooks has worked with this. I highly recommend his blog post, Getting the Most Out of Noise in UE4, where he takes Voronoi and he builds it up into cracked earth and caustic patterns and even marble. But personally, I like to use Voronoi for water, in particular turbulence. So building up here, throw it on a cylinder, add in some normals and mask it away, add in some world position offset and some quick stylized color, and you end up here. So I believe there is a fundamental affinity between the shapes that Ma Yuan was trying to capture here and the essence of Voronoi noise. And hopefully you can trace a direct lineage from Ma Yuan to this water shader. So a takeaway here is that focusing on energy more than detail and then using those energies to build up detail that's more appropriate actually empowers us to work in a wider range of art directions with more consistent results. And actually, it would have been possible to build either the fire or the water shader with like a slider from realistic to stylized. Would have been cool. I didn't do it. Ran out of time. So, in contrast, relying on surface detail like reflectivity and transparency is far less flexible. And had I chosen to rely on those things to make that water look like water, I suspect that the underlying energy of the water would have been inferior. And again, this works because there really are deep connections between disparate things in the world. Because static structures are records of energy flow. Everything comes back to energy flow eventually. Okay, so if we are thinking about Taoist aesthetics as essentially internalizing the Tao, okay, how do I do that? For myself, my path has been getting just really interested in these patterns. For example, patterns that emerge from Wolfram cellular automata. A cellular automata is basically just a grid of like on-off switches that have rules for just like their neighbors and what they're gonna do. And on rule 4, you can see that it's basically nothingness, and then full randomness is just noise, but with a grid of automata and a simple rule, actually really interesting, deeply rich forms can emerge, like Rule 60. And these forms happen to pop up, actually, all over the place. A shell is essentially a one-dimensional cellular automata. And I've also been interested in mathematical objects like a Sierpinski triangle, which is more or less a fractal. It operates on this simple rule, and it turns out that even a Sierpinski triangle shows up on shells. And this is actually mine. I have a collection of these cellular automata shells. This was from my desk a couple days ago, These are my scholar's rocks. But I think the better strategy to internalize the Dao is to just go out into the world, to train yourself to see the connections between things. And a great way to do that is by taking your own reference. This is Voronoi noise that I found in the wild very studiously on a beer glass. And I hope you can see the fundamental similarity between these forms in this beer foam and these beautifully depicted forms from Ma Yuan. So the takeaways I hope that I've left you with is that as effects artists, if you have to choose between energy and detail, the choice for me is clear every time: choose energy. It'll be far easier to add detail to something with good energy than try to add energy to something with too much detail. Also, that there really are deep connections between disparate things in the world. Like there are ideas from Taoism that are fundamentally true, and that we can make use of those general relationships between things to build up a sort of detail that works much better in motion than static detail. So to leave you with one last idea from Taoism, there's this concept of xiao yao you, which means free and easy wandering. And it is essentially to willingly shed some of the responsibilities from society, some of the expectations, and wander easily through the world, through nature in particular. So if you are finding yourself soon struggling on a problem with your head in your hands at your desk under a deadline, shake off the deadline. Go for a walk. Employ a little xiao yao yo. Go out into the world and maybe take some reference images while you're there. These are some suggested readings: the Taoist classics, Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, 2 books by Francois Julienne that are directly related to aesthetics, the Patterns in Nature book by Philip Ball that I mentioned, and that awesome Ryan Bruck's blog post, Getting the Most Out of Noise in UE4. Thank you. I think I burned up all the time with that video mishap, but okay. Yeah, if anybody has questions, I don't know, maybe the CAs will have an idea of what to do. Cool. Oh, do your evaluation, please. Thank you.
Hey, Jeremy. So I like to think about things pretty mathematically. I was wondering if Taoism and mathematics talked to each other much at the time, I guess?
That's a good question. I don't know of anything in the source texts, but within the intellectual history of China, ideas from Taoism played a strong role and interacted with other strains like Tiantai Buddhism and Chan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. And these schools tended to be more rigorous, so there might be something there to look into, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Cool. Seems it. Thank you so much, everyone.